Today we'll delve into one of the most unsettling stories the Appalachians have ever held within their mountains. There's something about those ancient, mist-shrouded, silent mountain ranges that seems to swallow secrets as easily as it swallows unsuspecting travelers. The Appalachian Mountains stretch for nearly 3,000 kilometers along the east coast of the United States, traversing states like Tennessee, West Virginia, and North Carolina, and for centuries they functioned as a natural frontier, a world within a world where the laws of the city rarely reached and where certain stories never found their way back to the living. It is in this setting that the figure of Silas Crowe begins to take shape. 51 years old. An age that, at that time, was already considered that of a man who had lived a full life, seasoned by time and the seasons. Silas was not young, but neither was he frail. There was something in the way he moved between the trails and valleys that suggested a dangerous familiarity with that territory, as if the mountains were not only his home, but its extension. Those who knew him from afar described a tall man, with a slow and deliberate gait, with clear eyes that seemed to register everything without revealing anything. Those who knew him closely, well, not everyone had the chance to tell that part of the story. The region where Silas Crowe established his presence was nestled between the foothills of eastern Tennessee and the deep valleys of West Virginia. It was a territory of brutal winters and dense summers, where trees grew so close together that the sun barely touched the ground during certain months of the year. The scattered communities lived in semi-isolation, connected to the rest of the country by dirt roads that winter transformed into impassable mud pits. There were no telephones. There was no radio. There was only word of mouth, slow and distorted like anything that needs to pass through many mouths before reaching its destination. And it was precisely in that silence that Silas Crowe learned to exist. No one knew for sure where he came from. Some said he was from somewhere in the interior of West Virginia, born into a family of hunters who rarely came down from the mountains. Others swore they had seen him decades earlier in a small community in Unicoi County, Tennessee, where he had briefly worked as a guide for groups wanting to traverse the region's most secluded trails. What everyone agreed on was that Silas knew that territory like few others. He knew where the Nolichucky River was most treacherous. He knew which valleys accumulated dangerously heavy snow in winter. Above all, he knew where no one would look, and this last part is the most important in this story. In the years when Silas Crowe began to attract attention, albeit very discreetly, almost imperceptibly, the Appalachians were experiencing a period of slow transformation. Groups of researchers and nature enthusiasts were beginning to explore the trails more frequently. Small expeditions set out from inland towns with the goal of mapping little-known stretches of the mountains. And with these expeditions came opportunities for experienced guides, for local suppliers, and it seems for men like Silas, who knew exactly what to do with the trust that outsiders so readily placed in them. The first time Silas Crowe's name was whispered with suspicion was one autumn afternoon when two men who had set out on a reconnaissance expedition in the vicinity of Carter County simply didn't return. No one panicked immediately. Temporary disappearances were relatively common in those mountains. Trails crossed, fogs closed in, and inexperienced men could get lost for days before finding their way back. But these two didn't return in days. They didn't return in weeks. And when an informal search was organized by neighboring communities, the only trace they found was an abandoned campsite on the banks of a tributary of the Watauga River, with belongings intact, the campfire extinguished, and no sign of a struggle. No visible signs, at least. Silas's name came up almost by accident. A merchant from Carter County mentioned, without much importance, that he had seen the two men talking to a tall, light-eyed hunter the afternoon before their disappearance. The description was vague, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt that in the following weeks would begin to grow silently and disturbingly among the residents of that isolated region of the Appalachians. And so begins the story of Silas Crowe, not with a revelation, but with an absence. Not with a scream, but with the absolute silence of two empty chairs in a campsite on the banks of a river that continued flowing as if nothing had happened. Because in the mountains, the river never stops, even when the stories stop halfway through. The Appalachian Mountains have a very particular way of keeping secrets, It's not like a locked drawer or a safe with a password. It's something more organic, more ancient. Trees grow over the tracks, rivers cover the marks, and the communities that live at these altitudes learn over generations that certain questions are more dangerous than the silence that surrounds them. It was within this logic that Silas Crowe's name began to circulate, not aloud, not in public squares, but in the most discreet corners of conversations, in that space between what is known and what is preferred not to be said. After the disappearance of the two men on the banks of the Watauga River, life in the communities of Carter County returned to its usual rhythm with a speed that, from the outside, might seem indifferent. But that wasn't it. It was survival. In those remote regions of Tennessee, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, life demanded a kind of brutal focus on the present. The approaching winter was more urgent than the mystery that remained. The harvests, the livestock, the roads, all of that had too much immediate weight for the absence of two strangers to occupy the center of concerns for long. Silas Crowe understood this better than anyone. He continued to appear on the outskirts of the communities with the same regularity as before, offering guiding services, selling game meat, exchanging information about trails. There was nothing in his behavior that screamed guilt, nothing that drew attention in the wrong way. On the contrary, there was a calmness about him that many interpreted as the natural serenity of a mountain man, accustomed to isolation and long periods of silence. But some, a few discreet ones, began to perceive something different in this calmness, an almost calculated quality, as if each word were weighed before being spoken, as if each gesture were rehearsed to reveal nothing more than necessary. It was a woman named Dora May Hensley, a resident of a small community outside Elizabethton, who first articulated aloud what many felt in silence. Dora May was not a woman of grand speeches. She was practical, direct, the type who preferred action to speaking. But one afternoon in 1903, while chatting with neighbors after a long week of fruitless searches for a missing merchant near Unicoi County, she said something that stuck in the memory of everyone present. Every time someone disappears in these mountains, Silas Crowe shows up somewhere nearby. It might be a coincidence, but too much coincidence starts to have another name. No one answered immediately, but no one disagreed. The missing trader was named Harlan Potts. He was 44 years old and known for running trading routes between small communities in Tennessee and West Virginia. He was experienced on the trails, not the type of man to get lost through carelessness. He had set off on a cold October morning with a loaded mule and hadn't reached his next destination. His mule was found 3 days later, alone, tied to a wooden fence on the edge of a secondary trail in the Appalachians, with the cargo intact. Harlan was never found, and Silas Crowe, as usual, had been seen in the vicinity 2 days before the disappearance. The pattern was beginning to take shape, albeit diffusely and without any concrete evidence that could be taken to any formal instance. At that time, in the most remote regions of Appalachia, the legal structure was fragile and scattered. County sheriffs operated with minimal resources and jurisdictions that barely covered the inhabited areas, let alone the vast forested expanses between them. A formal investigation required evidence, formal testimony, a chain of events that could be presented coherently. What existed regarding Silas Crowe was different. It was a web of presences, of appearances in the wrong places, of names that came up in conversations without anyone knowing exactly why. It was suspicion. It wasn't proof. And Silas knew this. There was, among those who knew him most closely, a growing sense that he understood very well the limits of what could be done against him. It wasn't arrogance. It was something colder. A tranquil awareness that, as long as there were no witnesses, as long as the mountains continued doing what they did best, he would remain exactly where he was, among the trees, among the trails, among the communities that depended on him to traverse the most enclosed stretches of that immense and indifferent territory. There was one trail in particular that Silas frequented regularly, known locally as Crowe's Pass, a name the older residents used to refer to a steep, shadowy stretch between two foothills in eastern Tennessee, where the vegetation was so dense that it blocked almost all sunlight even in the middle of summer. It was a path that cut hours off a longer route and therefore attractive to travelers in a hurry. Silas was one of the few who knew this stretch intimately. Every bend, every treacherous descent, every point where the ground gave way unexpectedly. It was the kind of knowledge that could save a life, or the opposite. Over time, that passage began to carry a sinister reputation that went beyond the simple discomfort of a difficult trail. Travelers who used it described a persistent feeling of being watched, not the kind of feeling that comes from animals in the woods, but something closer, more deliberate. Some reported out-of-place sounds, branches moving without wind, shadows that didn't correspond to any visible light source. Most attributed it to fatigue, altitude, the way the human mind fills empty spaces with what it fears most. But some weren't so sure. And while these stories circulated quietly among the communities of Carter County and Unicoi County, Silas Crowe continued his routine with an almost methodical regularity, appearing, disappearing, reappearing, always on the fringes, never in the center, like a figure who has learned that the best way to avoid being seen is to never stand still long enough to be truly observed. The mountains continued to hold their secrets, and Silas Crowe remained one of them. There is a moment in every dark story when the fog begins to dissipate, not completely, never completely, but enough for some shapes to begin to take shape. For the communities scattered across eastern Tennessee and the valleys of West Virginia, that moment arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the changing of the seasons in the mountains. It wasn't a single event that changed everything. It was the accumulation, the silent sum of absences that one by one began to form a pattern that no one wanted to fully acknowledge. Silas Crowe had a characteristic that, over time, became impossible to ignore. He never established lasting ties. He had no known family in the region. He had no close friends. He didn't have a fixed place that could be called home with any degree of certainty. There were rumors of a cabin in the foothills of Johnson County, in the far northeast of Tennessee, but no one could pinpoint exactly where it was. Some said they had passed nearby, but they always described the place vaguely. A dark wooden structure among the trees, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding forest, as if it had been built to blend in with it. This invisibility was functional. Silas appeared where it was convenient to appear, and disappeared before any presence could become too familiar. It was a way of existing that demanded discipline and patience, two qualities he seemed to possess in abundance. And it was precisely this combination that made any attempt to track him so frustrating for the few who tried. In 1907, a man named Wesley Callum decided he had seen enough. Wesley was a blacksmith in a small community on the banks of the Doe River in Carter County. He wasn't a man of grand ambitions or speeches. He was the type who solved problems with his hands and head without much ceremony. He had lost a brother-in-law 2 years earlier, on one of those trading trips that never reached their destination. His brother-in-law was an experienced trailman. He'd known that region for decades, and the last reliable account of his passage placed him in conversation with Silas Crowe one November afternoon on the edge of a trail outside Unicoi County. Wesley never had proof, but he was convinced. For months, he began to do what formal authorities couldn't: observe. With the patience of someone who had spent his entire life working with hot metal, Wesley constructed a mental map of Silas's movements through the communities in the region. He noted when he appeared, where he had been seen, and who he had spoken to. He discreetly talked to merchants, to women selling groceries, to men who maintained the dirt roads. It wasn't a formal investigation. It was something more primitive and, in a way, more effective. It was the logic of a closed community, trying to protect itself with the tools it had available. What Wesley had been putting together over those months was disturbing in its consistency. Silas Crowe had a habit of identifying lone travelers, men who made trade routes between communities, small groups of explorers, occasionally some outsider who arrived in the region without knowing the territory well. In these cases, he would approach them naturally, offering information about trails, suggesting alternative routes, sometimes offering himself as a guide for more complicated stretches. It was an approach that made perfect sense within the logic of that environment. Local guides were valued and relatively common. There was nothing immediately suspicious about the offer. The problem was what came next. Of the contacts Wesley managed to trace with some degree of certainty, men who had interacted with Silas in a documentable way, so to speak, a disturbing proportion had simply vanished in the following months. Not all of them. Not in a way that could be presented as proof of anything. But enough that the pattern was impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention. Wesley took what he had to the Carter County Sheriff in 1908. The conversation didn't go well. Not because the sheriff was indifferent or incompetent. He was a reasonable man with a clear understanding of the limitations of his work in that vast and poorly connected territory. The problem was exactly what Wesley knew beforehand. All he had were observations, coincidences, and the conviction of a man who had lost a relative. Without a body, without a direct witness, without any concrete evidence that could be presented in a formal instance, the sheriff's hands were tied in a way that the law of that time made absolutely real. Silas Crowe had not been seen committing any wrongdoing. He had simply been seen existing in the wrong places at the wrong times with a frequency that defied probability. And probability, as the sheriff explained with the weary gentleness of someone who'd had this conversation before, was not the same as evidence. Wesley emerged from that conversation with the same conviction as before, but with a new and bitter understanding of the terrain he was treading on. The mountains were not merely Silas Crowe's habitat, they were his most effective protection. The vastness of that territory, the dispersion of the communities, the fragility of the connections between them, the absence of any infrastructure that could centralize information and create a coherent framework of suspicion. All of this worked in favor of a man who had learned over the years to operate precisely within those gaps. It was a form of intelligence that didn't require formal education or any kind of urban sophistication. It was something more fundamental, an accurate reading of the environment and its unwritten rules, combined with a patience that most people simply don't possess. While Wesley Callum returned to his blacksmith shop on the banks of the River Doe empty-handed, Silas Crowe continued his routine in the mountains. The trees continued to grow over the tracks, the rivers continued to cover the marks, and the Appalachians remained what they had always been, a world within a world where certain stories found ways to remain buried for far longer than anyone would care to admit. There is a particular quality to fear that grows slowly. It is not the sudden shock that paralyzes for a moment and then passes. It is something that settles in the deepest layers of daily life, that changes the way people look at the paths they travel every day, that transforms simple gestures into silent calculations of safety. It was this kind of fear that began to take hold in the communities of eastern Tennessee and the neighboring valleys of West Virginia in the years following Wesley Callum's frustrated attempts to draw attention to what he had observed. It was not panic. It was something more insidious, a caution that became habit, a distrust that became second nature. The communities in that region had learned over generations to deal with the concrete dangers of the mountains. Brutal winters, treacherous trails, wild animals, accidents that happened far from any possible help, all of this was part of life in that territory and was faced with a pragmatism that came from custom. But the danger that Silas Crowe represented was of a different nature. It was a danger that wore the face of familiarity, that approached with the language of local assistance and experience, and that made it much harder to name, to point out, to defend. Travelers passing through the region began to notice a change in the behavior of local residents towards unfamiliar guides. Where there had previously been a natural openness, after all, knowing the local territory was a genuinely valuable skill in those mountains, there was now a new reserve, a hesitation that hadn't existed before. Questions that would once have been answered in detail began to be answered more vaguely. Offers of help were met with a polite gratitude that barely disguised the careful assessment happening beneath. Silas Crowe had changed something in those communities without ever being formally charged with anything. In 1911, a group of researchers from the University of Tennessee arrived in the region with the goal of studying the geological formations of the eastern foothills of the Appalachians. There were 4 men, all experienced in field expeditions, all familiar with the basic challenges of working in remote terrain. They arrived well-equipped and with a reasonably planned itinerary for 3 weeks of work in the mountains. For the first 2 weeks, everything went as expected. Gradual advances through the territory, sample collection, careful record-keeping. It was in the 3rd week that things changed. One of the researchers, a man named Edmund Farris, had briefly separated from the group to examine a rock formation a few hundred meters from the main trail. It was a common procedure, something he had done several times during the expedition without any problem. But this time, when the other three went to check on him after a few hours without contact, Edmund was not where he had said he would be. His equipment bag was leaning against a rock as if it had been carefully placed there. His measuring instruments were arranged in an order that suggested the work had been interrupted abruptly, not gradually. Edmund Farris was never found. The three remaining researchers descended from the mountains and reported the disappearance to the Carter County authorities. A search was organized, more structured than previous ones thanks to the pressure the university managed to exert on local authorities. For days, groups scoured the areas around Edmund's last known location, covering a considerable area with a degree of systematization that previous searches had rarely achieved. They didn't find Edmund, but they found something no one expected. In a small clearing about 2 kilometers from where Edmund had disappeared, the searchers came across traces of a campsite that had been used regularly for a long period, not the marks of 1 or 2 nights, but of an extended presence, of someone who used that place as a base with considerable frequency. There were makeshift wooden structures, partially camouflaged by the surrounding vegetation. There were marks of old, multiple campfires, layered in superimposed ways that suggested recurring use over months or perhaps years. And there were other things, various belongings of different kinds that didn't seem to belong to a single person or a single moment. Objects mixed together without apparent logic, as if they had been accumulated over time without any criteria beyond their mere existence. The Carter County Sheriff was called to the scene. This time, the conversation was different. Not because the evidence was conclusive, it was still far from it, but because the discovery of that campsite created, for the first time, a fixed point, a concrete place that could be associated with a specific presence in those mountains. And when the oldest inhabitants of the region were consulted about who might use that area so regularly, one name emerged consistently, without anyone needing to be guided to it: Silas Crowe. The sheriff sent 2 of his men to locate Silas and bring him in for a formal conversation. It wasn't an arrest, there was no legal basis for that yet. It was a conversation, as the authorities were keen to make clear to everyone who asked. But it was a conversation that finally had an address, a direction, a concrete starting point after years of suspicions swirling around without finding a place to land. The sheriff's 2 men spent 3 days in the mountains. They couldn't find Silas Crowe. They found signs that someone had been in the Johnson County cabin, the structure that residents had described so vaguely for so many years, but it was empty. Not abruptly abandoned, not showing signs of a hasty escape. Simply empty, tidied with an almost meticulous order, as if the occupant had left deliberately, with enough time to put everything in its place before leaving. As if he knew someone was coming. This possibility, that Silas had been warned, or had realized on his own that the net was closing in, was what most disturbed the sheriff and the few who were closely monitoring the situation, because it implied a level of situational awareness that went beyond the simple instinct for survival. It implied that Silas Crowe had been monitoring not only the mountain territory, but also the state of suspicion growing around him, calculating, adjusting, anticipating. The mountains of eastern Tennessee grew a little quieter that autumn of 1911, not in the tranquil way that mountain silence usually is, but in the tense, heavy way of those who know that something has moved in the shadows without being able to say exactly where it went. When a person disappears in the mountains, there's a window of time in which hope still fuels the search. People move with urgency, with purpose, with that particular energy that comes from believing that every hour matters. But when that window closes, and it always does one way or another, what remains is not just the absence of the person. It's the absence of the answer. And this second absence has a different, more permanent weight, settling into communities in a way that time rarely manages to completely dissolve. The communities of eastern Tennessee knew this weight well in 1911. They had carried versions of it for years, accumulated in silence, piled one on top of the other without any of them finding resolution. And now, with the discovery of the mountain camp, and the subsequent disappearance of Silas Crowe from the territory he had inhabited for so long, this weight took on a new dimension, that of a story that had come close to a turning point without actually crossing it. Silas had disappeared. But disappearing wasn't the same as solving the problem. In the months following the fall of 1911, the Carter County Sheriff kept a low profile of any reports that might indicate Silas's presence in other regions. It was slow and fragmented work, given the nature of communications at the time, dependent on correspondence, on reports passed down by word of mouth, on personal connections between authorities from different counties who didn't always have the habit of sharing information systematically. But some things began to come in. The first report came from West Virginia. A man matching Silas's description, tall with light eyes, a slow, deliberate gait, had been seen near a small community in Mercer County, in the southern part of the state, around early 1912. He hadn't done anything remarkable according to those who had observed him. He had bought some groceries at a local store, inquired about trails in the area, and left without leaving a name. It was the kind of passage that would normally leave no trace, but the merchant who had served him was an observant man, and the description he gave to the local sheriff when consulted later was detailed enough to be significant. The second report came from North Carolina. In a mountain community in Yancey County, a local guide had mentioned to a group of travelers that an outsider had been in the area recently, asking the sort of questions typically expected of someone surveying the territory: alternative routes, river crossings, less populated areas. The guide had found the questions strange enough to comment on, but not concerning enough to report to someone in authority. It was 1912, and the name Silas Crowe had not yet traveled outside of Tennessee with any degree of formal urgency. That was exactly what Silas seemed to be saying. The logic of what he was doing, seen from a distance, had a cold and efficient coherence. The Appalachians stretched across a vast area, traversing multiple states with separate jurisdictions and varying levels of communication between them. A man who knew this territory well could move along the mountain range with relative ease, reinventing his presence in each new region without carrying the weight of what he had left behind. He didn't need forged documents or any sophisticated elaboration. He only needed distance and the fact that in 1912, coordination between authorities of different states was slow, erratic, and often dependent on personal initiatives that rarely materialized. It was a form of escape that used geography as an ally. Wesley Callum, the blacksmith from the Doe River who had tried to bring Silas to his attention years before, learned of the reports through the connections he had built during his months of observation, and he reacted in the only way his nature allowed, with a renewed determination that many around him found admirable and an equal number found reckless. Wesley began writing letters to county sheriffs along the Appalachians, to state authorities in West Virginia and North Carolina, to any instance that could receive the information and do something with it. Most of the letters did not generate an immediate response, but some ended up in the right hands. A deputy in Ashe County, North Carolina, named Thomas Briggs, was the kind of man who read every piece of mail that arrived on his desk, with an attention that his colleagues often found excessive. Briggs was 38 years old in 1912 and had spent most of his career dealing with the particular challenges of maintaining some order in remote mountainous territories. He knew well the dynamics of isolated communities, the fragmented way information circulated, and the tendency of authorities from different jurisdictions to treat their problems as exclusively local until they became impossible to ignore. Wesley Callum's letter arrived on Briggs's desk one afternoon in March 1912. He read it twice. Then he wrote to the Carter County Sheriff asking for more details. This exchange of correspondence between Briggs and the Tennessee Sheriff lasted several months and produced, for the first time, something that had been lacking in Silas Crowe's entire history up to that point: a consolidated written record that connected the scattered accounts of different communities into a single narrative framework. It wasn't a formal accusation. It didn't have the legal weight necessary to set any process in motion, but it was a document that existed, that could be consulted, that created an institutional memory where before there had only been oral memory. It was a start, late, incomplete, but real. While this correspondence slowly built up across the mountains, Silas Crowe continued his movement through the Appalachian territory with a fluidity that seemed to defy any attempt to anchor him to a specific place. The reports that arrived were always from just a few days ago, enough time for any verification to be too late. It was like trying to capture a shadow that moved at exactly the speed needed to always stay one step ahead of the light. But shadows, however skillful they may be at moving, leave traces when the terrain is observed with sufficient patience. And there were people, in more than one state along the Appalachians, who were beginning to observe with exactly that kind of patience, silent, methodical, and utterly determined not to let another season pass without some answer beginning to take shape in those ancient silent mountains. Thomas Briggs was the kind of man who understood that patience wasn't passivity, it was strategy. During the months he corresponded with the Carter County Sheriff, he had built in his mind a map that went far beyond the paper, a map of behaviors, of patterns, of a logic that began to reveal its contours with a clarity that the isolated pieces could never have produced on their own. And what this map showed was disturbing not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. Silas Crowe wasn't unpredictable. He was predictable in a way that only those looking at the big picture could see. He always moved along the Appalachian mountain range, never straying too far from the mountains. He preferred small communities, isolated enough that a new face wouldn't attract much attention, but with enough travelers that his presence wouldn't be completely anomalous. He stayed for short periods, long enough to establish a minimal presence, identify opportunities, and leave before any real familiarity developed. It was a cycle he had refined over years, and it worked with an efficiency that depended fundamentally on one thing: the lack of communication between the communities and authorities along his route. Briggs understood that to break this cycle, he needed to attack precisely this dependency. In mid-1912, he began building what would be, by the standards of the time and that territory, a network of attention, a set of contacts in communities along the Appalachians of North Carolina and West Virginia, ordinary people who agreed to send him mail if a man matching Silas's description appeared in the area. It wasn't a sophisticated operation. It was fundamentally a chain of watchful eyes connected by letters, operating at the speed of rural Appalachian mail, which wasn't fast, but it was faster than nothing. When Wesley Callum learned what Briggs was planning, he offered immediate help. His network of contacts in Tennessee, built over years of discreet observation, perfectly complemented what Briggs was establishing further south. Together, the two men created something Silas Crowe had never encountered before, a coordinated effort that spanned multiple states, connecting points that had previously existed in complete isolation. It was still slow, still fragmented, still dependent on the goodwill of ordinary people, with no formal obligation to participate. But it existed. The first test of this network arrived in the autumn of 1912. A letter arrived in Briggs from a small community in Watauga County in northwestern North Carolina. A local trader reported the presence of a man matching Silas's description, who had spent 2 days in the area asking about trails toward West Virginia. The trader had sent the letter immediately after the man's departure, and it reached Briggs in less than a week, fast enough that the information was still of some use. Briggs sent immediate correspondence to his contacts in 3 communities along the most likely route Silas would be taking northward. It was a gamble. He wasn't sure of the route. He had no way of knowing precisely where Silas was going. But based on the pattern of movements he had studied, there were 2 or 3 routes that made the most sense, within the logic of displacement that Silas had demonstrated over the years. One of the bets was correct. A contact in Grayson County, in southwest Virginia, confirmed the presence of a man matching the description at a small roadside store about 10 days after the Watauga County correspondence. The man had purchased supplies, inquired about road conditions further north, and set off toward the eastern foothills. It was the first time the network had operated in real time. Briggs felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel in the context of that work, a spark of cautious optimism. It wasn't euphoria, it was the sober recognition that, for the first time in years, there was a concrete possibility that Silas Crowe could be located before he disappeared again deep in the mountains. It was a small possibility, still dependent on many variables beyond anyone's control. but it was real in a way that none of the previous attempts had managed to be. He immediately wrote to the sheriff of Wythe County, Virginia, requesting heightened vigilance for any man matching the description who appeared in the area in the following weeks. The sheriff of Wythe County was a pragmatic and experienced man named Arthur Peel, who read Briggs's correspondence with the natural skepticism of someone who had received many warnings that had led to nothing concrete. But there was something about the way Briggs had written, the specificity of the details, the consistency of the pattern described, the evidence that it was the product of months of careful work and not an impulsive suspicion, that made him fold the letter more carefully than usual and put it in his pocket instead of in a drawer. It was the small gesture of a man who wasn't yet sure what to do with a piece of information, but who had enough experience to recognize when something deserved more attention than immediate dismissal. In the following weeks, Arthur Peel instructed his men to pay special attention to lone travelers who demonstrated unusual knowledge of the local trails, without being recognized as residents of the area. It was an instruction vague enough not to create unnecessary alarm, but specific enough to direct attention in a useful way. Then, on a cold November afternoon in 1912, one of Peel's men reported seeing a lone traveler near a back road in rural Wythe County, tall, with a slow, deliberate gait, and clear eyes that the man described as having an evaluative quality that had made him uneasy, without him being able to explain exactly why. The man had followed the trail eastward and disappeared among the trees before anyone could approach him. But this time, unlike all previous times, someone was waiting on the other side of that trail, because Briggs, based on the patterns he had studied, had anticipated that exact direction as one of the most likely. And the contact he had established in County Carroll, immediately east of County Wythe, had been instructed to observe and report any unusual movement on those trails during that period. The Appalachian Mountains, for the first time in many years, were being observed in a way that Silas Crowe perhaps hadn't fully grasped. And that difference, small, technical, almost invisible, was exactly the kind of change that could transform the outcome of a story that had lasted too long without finding its turning point. Winter in the Appalachians has its own way of redefining possibilities. Trails that still allowed reasonable movement in autumn become traps of frozen mud and accumulated snow. Distances that seemed manageable in summer transform into obstacles that consume entire days of careful travel. And the isolation, which in other seasons was merely a characteristic of the region, becomes something more absolute in winter, a condition that closes communities in on themselves and drastically reduces the movement of people between them. For Thomas Briggs, the winter of 1912-1913 was both an obstacle and an opportunity. It was an obstacle because it slowed the flow of mail, compromised the ability of anyone trying to cover territory in the mountains to move around, and reduced the frequency of reports coming through the network he had so carefully built over the previous months. But it was also an opportunity, because these same limitations applied to Silas Crowe with equal force. A man who depended on constant mobility to maintain his invisibility found in the Appalachian winter an adversary that could not be negotiated with or circumvented, only confronted or awaited, and waiting meant standing still for longer than usual. Briggs' contact in Carroll County had reported something interesting in late November 1912, not the confirmed presence of Silas, but signs that someone had been using an abandoned structure near a secondary trail as temporary shelter. The structure was known to locals as an old resting place for drovers, built decades earlier and long out of regular use. It was dilapidated but still functional enough to offer protection from the elements during the colder months. Briggs received this information and held on to it for several days, carefully weighing his options with the understanding that a hasty move could undo months of patient work. Sending someone to check the site immediately was risky. If Silas was still around and realized the place was being investigated, he would disappear before anything could be done. But waiting too long also had its risks, because winter wouldn't last forever, and the window of relative stillness he created would close with the arrival of spring. It was Arthur Peel, the sheriff of Wythe County, who suggested the approach that was eventually adopted. Instead of sending someone directly to the identified location, Peel proposed increasing a discreet presence on the trails surrounding the area, not in a way that looked like an active search, but with the naturalness of routine patrols that any sheriff could justify without raising suspicion. It was an approach that required coordination with Carroll County authorities and patience to let the process unfold at its own pace. Carroll County Sheriff Edmund Voss agreed to the strategy after an exchange of correspondence with Peel that lasted almost 2 weeks, a surprisingly short time in that context. Voss was new to the job, having taken it on less than a year before, and perhaps for that reason he brought with him a willingness to cooperate that authorities more entrenched in their territories sometimes lost over the years. The operation began in January 1913. During the following weeks, Voss's men patrolled the trails around the old drover's post with a regularity that was calculated to appear casual. They didn't approach the place directly. They observed from distances that allowed some visibility without revealing their presence, and they reported any movement or sign of activity with a frequency that kept Briggs and Peel informed almost in real time, or the equivalent of real time when communication depended on riders carrying mail along snowy trails. In early February, one of Voss's men noticed smoke rising from the dilapidated chimney of the old outpost at dawn. The information reached Briggs 2 days later. He read the mail on his desk in County Ash and remained silent for a long moment. It wasn't confirmation that it was Silas. Any traveler trapped by the winter could be using that shelter. But the combination of factors, the location within the corridor that Silas had shown he preferred, the timing within the seasonal pattern that Briggs had analyzed, the way the use of the location seemed deliberate and not accidental, created a probability he couldn't ignore. He wrote to Peel and Voss immediately. The reply took 4 days to arrive, traversing the snow and cold of the Appalachians at a speed that was both a logistical miracle and a source of frustration for everyone involved. When it arrived, it brought additional information. A resident of a nearby farm had reported seeing a tall man with light eyes fetching water from a stream near the outpost the previous afternoon. The man had quickly moved away when he realized he was being watched. This behavior was consistent with what was known about Silas. Briggs made a decision he had been putting off since the beginning of that operation. He wrote to Peel asking him to organize a formal approach to the site, not an aggressive assault, but a sufficient official presence to create a situation where Silas didn't have the simple option of just walking into the trees and disappearing, as he had done so many times before. It was a moment that demanded sufficient numbers to cover the site's natural exits and sufficient authority to justify a direct approach. Peel replied that he would need at least a week to organize what was necessary without unnecessarily alerting anyone. It was February 1913, and for the first time in over a decade of scattered suspicions and failed attempts, there was a real convergence of people, information, and intent around a specific geographical point in the Appalachians. It was no guarantee of anything. The mountains had thwarted expectations before and certainly could do so again. But there was something different about this moment, a quality of concrete possibility that previous attempts had never managed to produce. When Wesley Callum received a letter from Briggs describing the situation in deliberately vague terms, but clear enough for anyone familiar with the context, he read the text 3 times in a row in his blacksmith shop on the banks of the River Doe. Then he carefully folded the letter and put it in his chest pocket. She had waited for this moment for almost a decade, and the mountains, which had held so many secrets for so long, were about to be tested in a way unlike anything that had come before. The week Arthur Peel had asked him to prepare for passed with the particular slowness of weeks when something important is about to happen. The cold of February 1913 kept the mountains of southwestern Virginia covered in a layer of snow that made any movement more visible and any planning more complicated. Peel knew this was a double-edged sword. The snow made a discreet approach difficult, but it also made it much harder for anyone to move through the territory without leaving a trace. It was the first time in all of history that geography had worked against Silas Crowe instead of in his favor. Peel assembled a group of 6 men, enough to cover the natural exits of the old drover's post without creating such a large movement that it could be noticed from afar. He chose the men carefully, prioritizing those with experience in mountainous terrain. and the temperament necessary for an operation that required restraint and observation before any direct action. He didn't want impulsive men. He wanted men who understood that the objective was a controlled approach, not a confrontation. Edmund Voss from County Carroll contributed 3 more men who knew that particular area better than any outsider could. They were local residents with experience on the trails around the outpost, able to move through that terrain with a naturalness that outsiders simply could not have replicated. The operation was planned for a Monday morning, when movement on the trails would naturally be less intense and any additional presence less anomalous than on days with higher traffic. The previous evening, Briggs had arrived in Carroll County after a 2-day journey from Ashe County. He hadn't been formally invited. He had simply insisted on being present at a moment that represented the culmination of months of his work. Peel received him unceremoniously, with the practical respect of one who acknowledges another's contribution without needing to elaborately verbalize it. The 2 men spent the evening reviewing the plan with Voss in a small room warmed by a fireplace, over a rudimentary map of the area drawn by one of the local men. The morning arrived grey and cold, with a low sky that promised more snow before noon. The 9 men set off before dawn, divided into 3 groups that would approach the location by different routes, converging to cover the exit points identified during the previous observation days. It was a plan that depended on temporal coordination. Each group needed to be in position before any direct approach was made, to eliminate the possibility of someone simply walking out of reach through an exit that no one was covering. Briggs stayed with Peel's group, which would take the most direct route toward the main entrance to the outpost. The terrain was difficult. The snow had hardened overnight and gave way unevenly underfoot, creating a progression that was both noisy and unstable. Peel had instructed his men to move slowly, prioritizing silence over speed, accepting that the approach would take longer than it normally would. It was the right decision, but it made every minute of the march a constant negotiation between urgency and caution. When the old outpost became visible among the trees, Peel raised his hand, signaling for a stop. Smoke was coming out of the chimney. The group stood motionless for several minutes, observing, checking the signs that previous days of surveillance had established as indicators of an active presence. The smoke was consistent with a recent campfire, not the dead embers of a fire that had been lit and abandoned hours before. There was a mark in the snow near the entrance that suggested recent passage. Peel exchanged a glance with Briggs. The other 2 groups were positioning themselves at the designated side exits, following the schedule that had been established the previous night. Peel waited the agreed-upon time, mentally counting the minutes with the concentration of someone who knows that timing is everything at that moment. Then he gestured for me to move forward. The approach to the outpost was made with a controlled speed that contrasted with the careful slowness of the previous advance. Peel and 2 of his men went directly to the entrance, while the others took up lateral positions that complemented the cover of the groups on the flanks. The gas station door was closed but not locked. Peel opened it firmly and entered with his men immediately behind him. The interior was small, with a single main room lit by the dim light filtering through an ice-covered window and the glow of embers in the stone hearth in the corner. There were clear signs of recent occupancy. A blanket folded over a wooden frame that served as a makeshift bed, the remains of a simple meal, travel equipment arranged with the meticulous order that accounts of Silas had always mentioned. But the gas station was empty. Peel crossed the space in 3 steps and reached the back window. The glass was broken in one corner, not violently but carefully removed, creating an opening just wide enough for a person to pass through. In the snow outside, clearly visible even in the dim light of that grey morning, were footprints leading eastward, toward the denser trees on the hillside. Someone had left that way recently. Very recently. Peel looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the footprints. There was something in both their expressions that wasn't exactly surprise. It was the bitter recognition of men who had come very close, closer than they had ever been before, but still not close enough. The flanking groups were immediately redirected to follow the footprints, but the eastern slope was steep and covered in dense vegetation, making rapid progress virtually impossible. The footprints were followed for almost 2 kilometers before disappearing into a rocky area where snow did not accumulate and the terrain left no trace. Silas Crowe had escaped again. But this time there was a fundamental difference compared to all previous escapes. This time there was concrete physical evidence of his presence in a specific location at a specific time, documented by authorities from 2 different counties who had acted in a coordinated manner. There were footprints in the snow. There was the modified window. There were the belongings left behind in the haste of an escape that, for the first time, had been forced by the very proximity of an organized approach. For the first time in all of this history, there was an official record that placed Silas Crowe in a specific time and place in a way that no alternative narrative could easily undo. It was less than Briggs had expected to find that morning. It was more than any previous attempt had managed to produce. And in the snow-covered Appalachian Mountains, that February of 1913, that distinction mattered in a way that everyone present understood without needing words to express it. There is a particular kind of defeat that doesn't feel like defeat, the kind where you've gone further than any previous attempt, done everything right within the limitations you had, and yet the result falls a few steps short of what was needed. Thomas Briggs knew this feeling well as he descended the mountains of County Carroll that afternoon, in February 1913, the cold cutting through his layers of clothing and the image of his footprints in the snow repeating in his head with a persistence that left no room for anything else. It wasn't despair. It was something more controlled, the internal reorganization of a man who understands that the work continues, that what has been built doesn't disappear with an incomplete result, and that each step taken, even those that don't reach their intended destination, creates a foundation for the next. Briggs had spent months building a network, coordinating authorities from multiple states, establishing a documented standard that previously didn't exist in any official form. None of that had disappeared with the broken window and the lost footprints on the rocky hillside. Arthur Peel, pragmatic as always, put the situation in simple terms while the 2 men had coffee at a small shop in Carroll County that afternoon. For the first time, he said, Silas Crowe had been forced to act reactively. All previous escapes had been planned in advance, executed at the time and pace he himself chose. This time he had escaped through a broken window in haste, leaving his belongings behind, being pushed along by the movement of others instead of moving of his own accord. It was a change in dynamics that mattered. Briggs agreed, but he knew that a change in dynamics was not the same as resolution. Silas was back in the mountains, with winter still offering enough cover to make any systematic search extremely difficult. And there was the question that neither had fully verbalized, but that both carried: how long could this pursuit last? The authorities involved had other responsibilities, limited resources, and jurisdictions that placed real limits on the scope of any coordinated operation. The answer came from an unexpected direction. A week after the raid on the drovers' station, Wesley Callum showed up in Carroll County. He had traveled from Tennessee unannounced, which was entirely consistent with his straightforward nature and his impatience with any process that seemed to be losing momentum. He arrived with information he had received through his own contacts in eastern Tennessee. A man who knew the mountains of Johnson County had casually reported, in a conversation without any investigative intent, that he had found signs of recent presence in a specific area of the eastern Tennessee foothills that had been years before associated with Silas's original cabin. It was information that at any other time might have seemed like just another vague fragment in a story full of them. But in the context of what had just happened in Carroll County, it carried a different weight. Silas had been pushed out of his corridor in Virginia and North Carolina more intensely than he had ever experienced. And when people are pushed out of unfamiliar territory, there is a fundamental and almost universal tendency to seek what they know best. The territory Silas knew best was eastern Tennessee. Briggs and Peel stared at the map for a long hour that night. The logic was clear, but so was the challenge. Johnson County was in Tennessee, outside their jurisdiction, and any action there would depend on cooperation that would need to be built from scratch with local authorities who were not part of the network that had been patiently assembled over the previous months. Wesley Callum, who had been listening to the discussion with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment to speak, said only one thing when the 2 men had finished mapping out the obstacles. He knew the sheriff of Johnson County. Not officially. It was a personal connection, the kind you build over years of living in a region where everyone eventually crosses paths with everyone else. The sheriff's name was Calvin Reese. He was 52 years old, and Wesley knew him as a man of sound judgment who didn't need much preamble to understand the essentials of a situation. Wesley left for Tennessee 2 days later, with a letter from Briggs in his pocket and a clear understanding of what needed to be communicated to Calvin Reese, and how. The conversation between Wesley and Reese took place one afternoon in March 1913, in a blacksmith shop in Johnson County, owned by a cousin of Wesley's, neutral territory, and familiar enough for the conversation to take place with the direct honesty that the situation demanded. Wesley presented the complete picture without omissions or unnecessary dramatizations. The years of suspicion in the communities of Carter County, the frustrated attempts to bring the matter to the authorities, Briggs' work building the network of contacts, the operation in Carroll County, and what had been found and lost that February morning. Calvin Reese listened to everything without interrupting. When Wesley finished, he remained silent for a moment that stretched long enough to create a subtle tension in the room. Then he said he knew the name Silas Crowe. Not through investigative means, he knew them in the way one knows names that circulate in hushed tones in mountain communities, names that carry a particular quality that people intuitively recognize but rarely articulate aloud. He had come to know them years before through fragmented conversations with residents of communities in the northern part of the county, people who lived near the eastern foothills and who had a relationship with that territory spanning decades. Reese agreed to cooperate. In the following weeks, with a discretion that Briggs had specifically requested in his letter, Reese began activating his own contacts in the communities of northern Johnson County, people who knew that specific area of the foothills with the intimacy that only long life in a place can produce. The question he asked, indirectly and carefully, was simple. Were there signs of recent human presence in the more remote areas of those foothills that did not correspond to the normal movement of local residents and hunters? The responses that began to arrive throughout March 1913 were consistent in a way that Reese found significant. Yes, there was something. In the northern foothills, in an area that the oldest residents vaguely associated with a presence that had existed there years ago and had disappeared without explanation. Extinguished campfires found in places where no one from the community had camped. Signs that secondary trails were being used with a regularity that did not correspond to any known local use. The feeling, described by more than one person independently, of a presence in the surroundings that did not show itself but could be intuited in the small disturbances that any sustained human presence inevitably creates in the environment. Briggs received Reese's correspondence in early April 1913. He read it twice, with the careful concentration of someone checking every detail against what he already knows. Then he stood for a long time looking out the window of his office in County Ash, at the mountains stretching northward, thinking about the distance between where he was and where the story seemed to be converging. The mountains of eastern Tennessee were calling back not only Silas Crowe, but all those who had spent years trying to understand who he was and what he had done in those ancient mountain ranges. It was as if history had a gravity of its own, pulling all its elements back to where it had begun, for one last encounter with the questions that had resisted any form of answer for so long. Briggs began writing the response to Reese with the deliberation of someone who knows that every word matters and that what comes next cannot be rushed or delayed beyond what is necessary. East Tennessee was waiting, and this time there were more people waiting along with it. There are moments when a long and weighty story finally finds its point of gravity, that place where all the threads pulled over the years converge in a single direction, with an inevitability that looking back seems obvious, but which, while it was happening, was never guaranteed. For Thomas Briggs, for Arthur Peel, for Wesley Callum, and for Calvin Reese, that moment arrived in the spring of 1913, when the mountains of East Tennessee began to open again after winter, and the territory that had held so many secrets for so long became once more accessible to anyone with sufficient reason to enter it. Briggs arrived in Johnson County in late April, after a 3-day journey that had traversed part of the territory Silas had used as a corridor for years. There was something almost circular about this journey. Traversing the same mountains, crossing the same valleys, feeling the same weight of the silence among the trees that must have accompanied Silas's every move for over a decade. It was a silence that Briggs had learned to read differently than when he had begun this work months before. It was no longer just silence. It was the specific texture of a place that had witnessed things that